I've made a couple of videos now on fantasy, starting at a foundational level for the genre. If you haven't seen those videos, I would recommend you do. While you don't need to watch them to understand this one, each of these videos helps to shape a whole picture. The first video touches on the very foundation of fantasy, which is folklore and myth, and how utilizing the familiar can help your audiences engage with your work. We then followed that up with a session on how fantasy can sometimes feel generic or very similar, what causes that feeling, and a few ways that readers and writers can get rid of that. That video did hint at our next topic, however, and it's an issue that a lot of newer authors struggle with. Honestly, I do too, because it's one that can be very tempting to do in order to justify your own writing as unique. That problem is, as you no doubt have guessed by the title and thumbnail, when a fantasy world is too unique, or more precisely, when your fantasy writing is overcomplicated and unfriendly to readers. This is a complicated topic and highly opinionated, similar to the last video about the sameness in fantasy. I will provide what information and thoughts I have, and I'll provide resources and research in the description, alongside some of my notes that I was able to gather from those resources. Take the information you get from this video and do your own research after to get a better idea of what I'm talking about. With that said, hello and welcome to the Book Bin, or welcome back if you're a returning guest. I'm Conno Barlow, the Book Bin's proprietor. Take a seat and let's talk about excessive uniqueness in fantasy, or in another sense, overdeveloped and undercooked world building. The first place to start in fixing overcomplicated fantasy is within your world building. It's actually the primary place to fix these problems, and it's central to every other facet of your story. Think of some fantasy works you've read, played, watched, and consider which ones didn't connect with you. Some reasons will be aspects like plot or characterization being dull or flat, but you can probably think of fantasies in worlds that felt too vague, too confusing, or too packed full of things that didn't really matter and took up way too much space. Overcomplicated world building is an easy pitfall for a new fantasy writer to run into. It's even difficult for more experienced writers. I myself have battled with this, and I've had to ask myself all of the tough questions. Let's go with an example based on one of my projects, Psalms from the Mountaintop, which I've currently shelved for a while as I actually rework the world building and focus on projects I'm currently more invested in. Okay, so I have humans, elves, dwarves, orcs, pixies, I have kingdoms, their primary food sources are crops like potatoes and wheat, orchards with apples and berries, and then there's farming chickens or hunting rabbit and deer and... Oh no, this all sounds too like our own world or some kind of generic fantasy. What do I do to make it unique? Should I make up my own version of all these things? How can I make a rabbit my own interesting thing? It's these critical moments of early world building that can make or break a project. While it can feel derivative to keep so many things that are typical to fantasy or even to the real world in your work, there's a real danger to throwing it all away and trying to completely invent new things from the bottom up. While questions like, why are there rabbits and chickens when this world has pixies and monsters, and why do people eat potatoes when there's all sorts of magical plants, are good questions that you can ask, you can also fall into a dangerous trap of getting too deep in the weeds with no way out of small details that may ultimately not matter to your story. This is a challenging place to be in, and it's difficult to improve on, but let's consider some questions you can ask yourself and actions you can take to get through these complicated world building areas so you don't accidentally overdevelop a world when you really didn't need to. We'll start with Barry Lyga's questions on overcomplicating things. These questions are focused on plot, but a few of these are actually good, helpful things to consider when world building. You can find this resource in the description and use it for plots and writing your story, but I'm going to modify some of these questions to fit world building specifically. Question 1. When something already exists and accomplishes the exact same thing as the invented idea, ask yourself, is the invented idea really needed in the first place? Basically, if you find you're just inventing a rabbit, ask yourself if this invented version is actually important to making the world feel cohesive, or if a rabbit will do just fine and not take away from the world and story. Question 2. Even if something is cool or interesting, if it doesn't impact the characters or story in any interesting ways, is it needed? When you're inventing something, ask yourself how making it invented versus an already existing thing would actually change the way characters navigate the world, impact the story, and so on. If nothing fundamentally changes because you created a made-up word or substitute, did it need to be replaced? Question 3. Is enough enough? This one takes a lot of practice, and you'd be best to get feedback from others that you trust to be honest and critical of your work. If you feel like you're drowning in details, learn to say, "That's enough," and move on. Question 4. Sometimes you may have too much world building, and is it because you're trying to cram too many worlds into one? Not all of your unique ideas are bad. Sometimes you need to step back and ask yourself if this cool or unique idea is actually a problem, or if it would do better somewhere else in another world or project. Maybe write it down in a general world building idea list so you can reference it for a future project. These are some pretty useful questions to ask yourself while you build your world to make sure that everything in your work is purposeful and not just for the sake of trying to stand out and be unique. Of course, there will be plenty of places where you know you want something to be unique that maybe isn't necessary, but it ultimately comes down to picking your battles and determining what enhances your story and what will just confuse readers and risk them giving up on it. As I've mentioned, I included my research and some resources in the description, but I'd like to highlight a few things this time within that. In the research section, I included a few world-building resources with questions and topics to consider while you're world-building. These can be really helpful for you to think pointedly and specifically about your world. However, I have one recommendation that none of these will tell you, and it's one that I had to learn how to use. Answer a world-building question in less than 10 minutes. This might seem arbitrary or silly, but I'm pretty serious about it. If you find that you've gotten to a world-building question that, even if it intrigues you, you realize you've been researching agriculture and the original wheat farmers like I had, you may be going too deep. Now, this doesn't mean it's all pointless, and you'll need to practice finding a balance. If you realize that you've been researching and brainstorming for 10 minutes or more, it's time to compile your notes and put down the research to come back to later. The goal is to keep you moving forward and working through more ideas, and once you've had time building other parts of the world, you can come back later and review your notes with a new perspective based on other questions and building that you've worked through. By setting down tough aspects of world building and picking it back up, you get to learn a lot about how important that topic is. Do you pick up your research and realize you don't remember what any of it means? Do you keep running through the same encircling questions in research and feel like you're getting nowhere? Or maybe you have an aha moment when you come back to it and you have an answer. This is what you're looking for. If you come back to a part of your world building, ideally you want to have that aha moment. But there may be plenty of situations where you have to sit back and say, I have approached this part of the world building 3 times and I'm getting nowhere. Is this really important? Do I need to make up something unique, or can I just rely on conventions and norms already established in the world? Maybe you don't need to know the in-depth history of a fictional equivalent of wheat and how agriculture formed, developed, and adopted this fictional wheat. And maybe running in circles around it will waste your time and your reader's time down the line. Maybe it can just be wheat. If you find that you've done multiple 10-minute sessions and you're still struggling with the same question, take the question you're wrestling with and ask if it will serve your story and plot, or if it's set dressing that most people will overlook. While those small details are nice to know and have thought out, if you feel like completely inventing something to replace wheat is difficult and doesn't feel natural, and it doesn't serve the plot or actually change something important to the story, it's okay to accept that you probably don't need it and wheat is just fine. World building is hard but rewarding. Keep in mind all of these important aspects when world building and in the future. Is it servicing the story or plot? Is it just a new way to refer to the same idea? Am I getting too lost in the small things? Is there too much here to use in one story? How long am I taking on one topic or world building question? Once you've gotten a good grasp on these ideas, I promise world building will go much smoother. Next, and related, we will discuss a specific aspect of world building that was touched on a little here, and that's conlanging. A related issue that comes along is conlanging. Yes, even if you don't think you're conlanging in your fantasy world building, you probably are and just don't realize it. Conlangs can come in a variety of forms, from fully developed languages to just enough for naming conventions. And you may have just picked up on what I was about to get into. Yes, naming conventions, being entirely invented, can often be an absolute mess and lead to a lot of unnecessary confusion. There's a few ways this can happen, and all of them will impact your audience's understanding of your work. First, invented names might have unnatural sounds together. When you invent a language, even just to name characters and places, really consider your audience and their understanding of language. You should be researching phonemes and how different languages have different phonology. Now, that doesn't mean you should force yourself to be bound to English-only phonemes and morphology, because you'll have plenty of audience members who are multilingual anyway. But the point of learning about this is figuring out how languages will use sounds and pair sounds together, or even when languages have an absence of sounds that other languages have. Think about how affixes impact a word. For example, if you call a city Alvera and then you call a female character Loretta, the A suffix is likely associated with feminine in the world. You'll want to keep that in mind for future characters and places. It might not be the only affix to note femininity in a language, but being aware of this and making consistent decisions will help you better than just making it up as you go every single time. Related to this, keep a central theme to your conlanging when you do. Think of it like this. If you have a character named Santiago and a character named Fern, and they're both from Bolshevakia, well, you can quickly see how this can feel a little jarring. Of course, people have unique names that come from different cultures, but things you'll have to consider are how diverse the fictional populations are and what standards are expected culturally. These three names won't feel weird in some contexts, but might in others. Make sure you're thoughtful about the standards and keeping those things consistent. If both Santiago and Fern come from families from two different countries and they moved to Bolshevakia from other places, or perhaps their parents immigrated there, you can come up with ways to communicate this, like having them be the less common types of names. That would help a bit. Regardless, make sure you're intentional and thoughtful about this, because I think many new authors run into a problem of not thinking about cohesion when naming. Second is less about how the conlang is constructed and more about why you're applying it. Remember the example I gave in the last section about essentially remaking the rabbit and asking yourself if you're just making a rabbit and nothing is functionally different. A follow-up to that is asking, okay, if you plan to use a rabbit, do you really have to give it a different name? Renaming the rabbit causes unnecessary confusion for your reader. They're expecting something different from a rabbit when you rename the rabbit, so when you describe one, they're trying to piece something together in their mind that doesn't even look like a rabbit because they don't know it is one. Another example is to consider the times you've seen dragons, elves, orcs, dwarves, or other fantasy beings, and the author just randomly renamed it, even though you can tell based on everything they're saying that it's just a dragon or an elf. You don't need to invent fake terms and slap them on an existing creature. It just creates unnecessary confusion. Instead, by acknowledging it for what it is, your readers will know instantly what they're reading about and will have the mental image you actually want them to. A good piece of advice I saw on using a conlang versus the real-world term is based on specificity and context. The thread in question is someone asking about using the word kipao, also known as a cheongsam or a mandarin gown. Sorry if I pronounced any of those wrong. This is a very specific piece of clothing, and the word is meant to evoke a certain image, but the original poster was concerned that using the term will get readers thinking about China, and either are drawn out of the fantasy world or otherwise associating the Chinese culture with the fantasy world when it perhaps doesn't apply everywhere else, or lead to questions about how something specifically Chinese is known that way to the world if China doesn't exist. The top response is excellent at explaining when and why you would use an invented word. It's like writing English. Obviously, people in a fantasy world or the far future won't speak English, yet you present their dialogue in English or whatever language you write in. Does that put readers off? Certainly not. Writing in a fantasy language is what would put readers off. Terms are the same. If you use the current, in your language, general term for an item, people will accept that as a translation of some fantasy language word into their language. For example, a poncho, while not an English word, is the common term in English for a certain form of garment. If you use that word in a fantasy novel, it will feel just as natural as using it in the real world. Same would go for a sarong, a toga, a turban, and other really well-known exotic garments. Whether or not a kippah is one of those, I can't say. I just read the word for the first time, so would think it was an invention of yours when I read your book. Which would not put me off, because inventing terminology is a common convention, so you're on the safe side. The question is, on the other hand, is if the object itself is so universal that readers will accept it in a fantasy setting. A table is obviously a type of furniture that exists in different parts of the world and at different times, so encountering it in a fantasy novel would be acceptable. But a paper handkerchief is a recent development and not used in all parts of the world, so reading that someone uses it in a fantasy setting must be motivated. You cannot just have it there, but need to explain its existence. The other question is that of your narrative viewpoint. There are fantastic tales told from the viewpoint of one of our contemporaries. Usually that's when a person from our time and culture gets transported to a parallel fantasy universe or travels to the past or future in a time machine. This person will of course describe the alien world with our own words. But if the word was not exactly fitting the object, this narrator would certainly comment on that and explain to the audience how it was different. TLDR, if it is a universal object, you can use our word for it, even if that word is not native to the language you write in. If the word denotes an object that only exists in our culture or time, don't use it to describe a fantasy world with a different culture or level of technology. Many of the other replies are excellent as well. For example, the second top reply has a bit about inertia that I like that says, if you don't describe something specifically, readers will substitute what's familiar with their own lives. This is necessary and inevitable. Most of what's in your story will be similar to the real world. This is true of all fantasy stories, and readers, myself included, still find them plenty immersive. What these mean for you when world building and conlanging is that you need to think very critically about the purpose of your own invented words. If you know people will know what you mean when you use a very common word, like rabbit, but you're wanting to give your rabbit an invented name just to try to be different, that reason alone is probably not a good enough reason. If you're thinking about adding something like a Keurig coffee machine, you probably need to step back and figure out how to make that fit in your world. And also not even get close to referring to it as a Keurig, because that could be wildly confusing and jarring, and would lead to questions about why Keurig exists in your medieval fantasy. A final mention before we move on to the last section about how to be strategic in your writing uniqueness is to consider cognitive load. One article I found discussed this in terms of rules for magic systems, but I think this applies to conlanging as well as our next section in general. What you need to keep in mind when writing and introducing things to your reader is that a person can only retain a limited amount of information at any given time, and it's usually pretty limited in the short term. By extension, there's the concept of the magical number 7, plus or minus 2, some limits in our capacity for processing information, also called Miller's Law, which is essentially that, on average, a person can only retain about 7 new pieces of information in short-term memory that will be continually cycled out throughout the day until eventually whatever 7 are left over will be cycled into long-term memory at the end of the day. Now, we're not here to debate if these are legitimate or not. That's not our goal. That's what psychologists are studying and debating. Instead, we can keep these ideas in mind as we consider naming things and inventing language or introducing these invented concepts. When you're writing, consider how much new information you're throwing at readers. Not just plot and character, but all the things that may be entirely constructed in your fantasy that have no grounding in something familiar that the reader can latch onto. This doesn't mean you can't introduce those invented words or ideas, but remember that the more you throw at them all at once, the harder it'll be for your reader to actively remember it in the way you want them to. By keeping your reader's working memory in mind, you can look at your work critically and identify when there's way too much invented terms, words that could just get lost on your reader because they're taking on too much new information too quickly. Cognitive load and Miller's Law will come back shortly, but before they do, let's introduce the next area that you'll need to be critical of in your work. The final topic is one I've actually covered in a previous video, and now we're going to see the reverse of it: lore dumping. Lore dumps are something that can really ruin a story for the audience, especially when done poorly, and in a roundabout way, it will actually make unique elements of your world feel generic. Now, I'm a fan of lore dumping, so it's always made me sad to know that a lot of readers out there don't like it. I like when authors take the time to just explain interesting parts of their world to me, and I find it very interesting. However, what I do agree with most readers on is that lore dumping can easily kill a book when it's not interesting and it's in the middle of action. It's rightfully common for writing advice to emphasize that lore dumps quickly kill interest for your audience. This is usually because people seeking out fantasy are looking for escapism and adventure, and they want to explore the world you've dropped them into. So when you become a textbook about the world, they stop experiencing it, which can quickly turn them off to your story. If a reader feels like they're in a lecture hall being told what they want to experience rather than experiencing it, they may zone out or skip sections and miss out on critical information that's hidden within blocks of unfriendly text. Lore dumping can also cause confusion by interrupting scenes with explanations, which can not only be jarring to the reader, but can make the action itself confusing when you come and go from it frequently. This can also create a stagnation in emotional connection to your characters or story. Imagine a scene where a character is in a high-stakes conversation on the verge of discovering their origin and who they are, and then the next paragraph is a large block of text about the fantasy government and how it works. This may bore the readers, who may zone out, skim, or even skip the paragraph, and then they miss out on the critical reveal that this character is actually the missing princess. By cutting back on lore dumping, you can focus on the important pieces of the story. By extent, this makes the times where you have to explain things more intentional and easier for a reader to get through, especially if you can interweave it through the text rather than making it big blocks of technical information that disrupts the narrative or feels forced. To combat lore dumping, consider once again cognitive load and Miller's Law while writing, but also consider the iceberg theory and how it can be applied to your world building, not just your story. Iceberg theory is a useful writing tool both in story writing and in world building. Coined by Ernest Hemingway, iceberg theory is the ability to omit information or scenes intentionally to enhance the story, and that less is more. Ernest Hemingway had a few things to say about the theory. If a writer of prose knows enough about what he is writing about, he may omit things that he knows, and the reader, if the writer is writing truly enough, will have a feeling of those things as strongly as though the writer had stated them. The dignity of movement of an iceberg is due to only 1/8 of it being above water. A writer who omits things because he does not know them only makes hollow places in his writing. And a few things I have found to be true. If you leave out important things or events that you know about, the story is strengthened. If you leave or skip something because you do not know it, the story will be worthless. The test of any story is how very good the stuff that you, not your editors, omit. This is more complicated to implement in the actual storytelling, but it's a lot easier for considering how to implement your world building into your writing specifically, as far as lore dumping goes. To simplify Hemingway's explanation and apply it to sharing lore in your fantasy writing, think of it like this. You should know everything someone does need to know about the technical side of your work, but you should build the skills to determine what needs to actually be told, because there's no way around it, and what can or even should be left unsaid to leave a bit of mystery and intrigue in the world. An iceberg shows only a fraction of itself above the surface, and consequently, your world building is likely going to look the same. Readers may be able to get small glimpses beneath the waters, but you want to leave it at glimpses. The more you explain, the more like a textbook your work will feel. In addition to iceberg theory, let's briefly return to cognitive load and Miller's Law. Remember the idea that people can only retain so much information, and the more information you provide, the more confusing and difficult to remember it all will be. Now consider that in a scene you're writing. Say there's action happening and your character whips out a magical device to help them win the battle. What is the reader tracking in that scene? They're tracking the location, the main character, and the antagonists in the action scene. They're tracking other world-building elements, the goal of the story, and now there's a new object being introduced. That's a lot of things for one mind to juggle. What do you do when introducing this object? The best answer is simply to describe what the object looks like as briefly as you can, then show it in action. You don't have to explain where it comes from, who made it, why it exists, or how it functions on a technical level. Instead, show the main character using it and how it helps them in this situation using dynamic scenes and action verbs. This alone will keep the reader engaged and give them just enough to understand the object without trying to over-explain it or trying to shuffle it too hard into an already heavy load in their focus and memory. What are some other good tips to avoid lore dumping too much info that will make your reader get bored or frustrated, then retain none of the truly unique or interesting pieces of your work? Quill and Steel provides an excellent article with several recommendations, which we can quickly go over. 1. Show, don't tell. This was already mentioned briefly, but it's very important. You can't always show, and tell has plenty of merit in its own right. It is a book full of written words after all. But if you can show the world or lore instead of listing it out, try to do so. 2. Exposition through action. Let your characters do things to show off the world. An example Quill and Steel provides helps to explain this one perfectly. A burned hand says more about dangerous fire magic than a paragraph of rules. By showing us the consequences of something dangerous, you don't have to explain the rules for why it's dangerous. 3. Weave details into character perspectives. Show parts of the world and lore by letting the character take in those details. Would a peasant be focusing on the fine details of a building's architecture, or will they be more conscious of where they, with their social standing, can and cannot go around that building? Perhaps two vastly different characters go to the same shop. One focuses on the pricier objects, while the other focuses on used goods. Maybe there's even another character there focused less on goods and more on a very specific item they plan to steal, and are examining elements of the shop to figure out how best to steal it. 4. Use the iceberg method. This one we've already covered, so I won't elaborate here. 5. Break information into bite-sized pieces. This one is all about pacing when you know there's info you have to tell explicitly rather than show. Sometimes explaining a kingdom's politics or a magic system has to be done, simply because showing it isn't enough. Instead of writing entire pages of lore dumping, spread the information out throughout the scene. Follow the character's actions and interweave it between lines of dialogue. Show magic systems through trial and error so the reader learns with the protagonist instead of removed from them. 6. Make world building serve the story. If you need to explain something, make it a part of the action and involve it in what the characters need, want, or must do. Making your lore move the story forward allows you to show and tell at the same time and tie it into greater plot threads to keep a reader invested. 7. Use curiosity gaps. This is also like iceberg theory, but not quite the same. Instead of leaving something entirely absent, drop a hint about it, but don't elaborate. This can make a reader interested in learning more when it's relevant to your story. The example Quill and Steel gives is excellent. She tightened her grip on the dagger. Even the steel whispered at the old curse, though few alive remembered its origin. That sounds so interesting, and you don't even explain anything to the reader by sharing it. But I bet you want to know the answer to this little mystery now, don't you? 8. Organize your world building outside of the book. This is essential for any fantasy writer, to be honest. Now, I know some people like to develop all of their fantasy work entirely through pantsing instead of planning, but this is one that I think even a pantser should be willing to make adjustments on. Even if you develop some of your world building in your rough draft, you should take that information, then copy-paste it or write it out in a separate location that's exclusively all of your world building notes. This is helpful for a lot of reasons. Mainly though, you get the ideas out on a page, so you can remove it from your work if you find it's not necessary later on without actually losing the idea. And you can also make sure you're not forgetting things you've previously mentioned or develop inconsistencies or conflicting pieces of lore. Each of these tips should help you if you keep them in mind while writing or editing. Removing lore dumping is challenging for fantasy writers who just want to share all the cool ideas they have. I know, I do it too. It's a skill that takes time and building the right muscles to identify when it happens and how to correct it. It sucks that it takes trial and error and the act of really doing to learn, but with time you'll figure out your own tips and tricks and what you focus on when considering lore dumping. I read one author say they try to summarize lore in 2 sentences or less. While some authors recommend no more than a paragraph, this person went the extra mile and wanted tighter restrictions to really get good and practice at summarizing explanations. Hopefully, some of the tools I mentioned previously can help you handle lore dumping so that the unique aspects of your work can actually shine through without feeling like too much or being too overbearing. Well, this was quite a lot, and there might be a lot rattling in your head from all this. Let's quickly summarize, and hopefully that'll help you to move forward. Make sure your world building is well thought out and not undercooked, but if you're taking too long and running around the same loops or getting lost in the weeds, then step back and ask if this part of the world building is serving the story or not. Be intentional about what matters. Conlanging, be it full conlangs or naming conlangs, need to be thoughtful, consistent, and used only when truly necessary. Don't overload your reader with too many made-up names or terms if all it'll do is confuse them when you could have used a more familiar word. Lore dumping is tempting, but we need to avoid it when we can. Even when telling over showing is inevitable, consider ways you can weave it into the writing so readers aren't hit with blocks of technical information that disrupt the story. By balancing these things, you'll be able to make your work stand out without feeling sloppy, and the unique aspects of your world, which you want to be memorable and stand out to readers, will actually shine like you want them to. This goes hand in hand with the familiarity and pre-existing knowledge of folklore readers have, as well as generic fantasy. Ultimately, you will need to learn and practice balancing all of these things. And it takes time and effort to master, though nobody will ever be entirely perfect at it, as there's always room for growth. I hope this video and the previous videos in this topic were helpful for you, and I hope the resources I provided in the description will be useful for you to use, or at least help you know how to continue to research and learn about this topic yourself. I also hope that I am being as specific as I can be in a satisfying way. I find a lot of advice can feel a bit vague when I try to do some cursory looks myself, and I want to compile a lot of resources and paint a picture for someone using as many of them as possible to give specific lists and tools to take action with for your own writing. If you've gotten to this point, thank you so much for watching. Please leave any thoughts you have in the comments. I'd love to hear your own battles you've faced or other tips you've learned through your own experience on how to remove complications from your writing. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to like, subscribe, hype, whatever suits your fancy. And I look forward to seeing you around the book bin in the future.